I never thought I'd hear those words from someone in my own family. "You're nothing but a drain on our finances," Claire spat at me during one of her infamous Sunday dinners. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. I sat there frozen, my fork hovering over a plate of untouched mashed potatoes. Everyone else at the table fell silent. Daniel, my son, avoided eye contact, while their two kids stared at me as if waiting for a reaction. But what could I say? It wasn't the first time Claire had hinted at her resentment toward me living under their roof, but this was different. This was cruel. That night, after excusing myself early and retreating to my tiny bedroom upstairs, I replayed her words over and over again in my head. Drain. What did she think I was doing here? Did she imagine I enjoyed being treated like an unwanted guest in my own son's home? My heart ached not just because of her cruelty, but because Daniel didn't defend me. He simply sat there, quiet as a mouse, letting his wife dictate the narrative. I knew then that something inside me had shifted. For years I'd swallowed my pride, telling myself it was better to keep the peace. But now it felt like all that sacrifice meant nothing. The next morning I woke up before anyone else and decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The crisp autumn air stung my cheeks, but it cleared my mind. As I passed by familiar houses and waving neighbors, memories flooded back. Memories of when Daniel was little, how he used to hold my hand tightly as we walked together. Back then life felt simpler. I worked 2 jobs to give him everything he needed. New school clothes, piano lessons, even summer camp. I remember scraping together every penny so he could go to college without drowning in debt. And now here I am, accused of being a burden by the woman he married. When I returned home, I found an old shoebox tucked away in my closet. Inside were letters Daniel had written to me during his college years. One stood out, a crumpled piece of paper where he scribbled, "Mom, thank you for everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I read it. How could things change so drastically? When did my sacrifices stop mattering? Claire's words echoed in my mind again, louder this time. They weren't just hurtful, they were a challenge. If she wanted a fight, maybe it was time I gave her one. A week later, tensions simmered beneath the surface of our household. Claire had taken to rearranging furniture without consulting me, claiming she needed to optimize space. What she really meant was making sure my favorite chair was nowhere near the living room anymore. One evening, as I made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water, I tripped over a side table she'd moved into the hallway. My ankle twisted painfully, and though it wasn't serious enough to warrant a doctor's visit, the fall left me shaken. Claire rushed in, feigning concern, but her tone betrayed her true feelings. "Maybe it's time you considered assisted living, Margaret," she said casually, as if discussing the weather. Assisted living. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Later that night, lying awake in bed, I couldn't shake the anger building inside me. Assisted living? Was that what I deserved after raising a child, working tirelessly and giving everything I had to ensure my family thrived? Claire's audacity infuriated me. She acted like she was doing everyone a favor by taking care of me, but I saw through her facade. This wasn't about helping, it was about control. And suddenly I realized something important. I couldn't let her win. Not anymore. My determination led me to do something I never imagined I'd have the courage to do. I started snooping. Over the next few days, I paid close attention to Claire's habits. She spent hours on her laptop late at night, typing furiously while sipping coffee. One evening, when she stepped away to answer a phone call, I seized the opportunity. My hands trembled as I opened her laptop, but I'd been practicing with technology lately, determined to stay relevant. To my surprise, her email inbox was a treasure trove of incriminating information. There were emails detailing questionable business transactions, invoices altered to hide discrepancies, and even messages hinting at embezzlement. My stomach churned as I scrolled through them. Claire wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Here was my leverage, my chance to turn the tables. I copied the most damning evidence onto a USB drive and hid it in my jewelry box. As I sat alone in my room that night staring at the tiny device, I felt both exhilarated and terrified. Exposing Claire would mean stepping into uncharted territory, risking everything I held dear. But deep down I knew I couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything she'd done. The plan formed slowly, piece by piece, as I weighed the risks and rewards. I couldn't confront Claire directly, not yet. Instead, I decided to plant seeds of doubt elsewhere. Early one morning, while the house was still quiet, I sent an anonymous tip to Claire's employer. Attached were screenshots of the incriminating emails, along with a brief explanation of what I'd uncovered. Sending that email felt surreal, like crossing a line I'd sworn I'd never cross. But as soon as I hit send, a wave of relief washed over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I was finally taking control of my life. Days passed and the tension in the house grew palpable. Claire became increasingly agitated, snapping at Daniel and pacing the floors late at night. Then came the day when she stormed into the kitchen, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Someone tipped them off," she muttered under her breath, oblivious to my presence. Watching her unravel filled me with a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. Part of me wanted to step forward, to reveal myself and force her to face the consequences of her actions. But another part, the smarter part, knew I had to bide my time. The game was far from over. Claire's unraveling continued to unfold like a slow-motion car crash. She started skipping meals, locking herself in her home office for hours on end, and snapping at anyone who dared ask what was wrong. Daniel noticed too. How could he not? One evening, I overheard them arguing in hushed tones. "You're being paranoid," Daniel said, his voice tinged with frustration. "If you didn't do anything wrong, then why are you so worried?" Claire's response was sharp and defensive, accusing him of doubting her integrity. But even from my spot in the living room, I could hear the tremor in her voice. She knew she was caught. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. This wasn't the person I wanted to be, the kind who orchestrated someone else's downfall. Yet every time I thought about backing out, Claire's words echoed in my mind. "You're nothing but a drain." No, I reminded myself. I wasn't doing this for revenge, not entirely. I was fighting back against years of belittlement and control. Still, the weight of what I'd set in motion pressed heavily on my chest. I told myself it would all be worth it once justice was served. But deep down, I wondered if justice would ever truly feel satisfying. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel began spending more time with me. It was subtle at first. A shared cup of coffee here, a quiet conversation there. But soon we found ourselves reconnecting in ways we hadn't in years. He confided in me about his growing unease with Claire's behavior, how distant she'd become, and how much he missed the simplicity of our old relationship. "I don't know what's going on with her," he admitted one afternoon as we sat on the porch. "But it feels like she's hiding something." I nodded sympathetically, careful not to reveal too much. "Sometimes people act out when they're scared," I offered gently. Inside, though, I felt a flicker of triumph. Claire's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and Daniel was starting to see her for who she really was. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally beginning to shift in my favor. It didn't take long for Claire's world to collapse completely. One evening, she returned home visibly shaken, clutching an official-looking letter in her hands. Her face was pale, her usual confidence replaced by sheer panic. Without saying a word, she stormed past me and locked herself in her bedroom. Daniel followed close behind, demanding answers. Through the closed door, I heard snippets of their heated argument. Words like investigation and embezzlement floated through the air, confirming what I already suspected. The anonymous tip had worked. The next morning, Claire avoided eye contact with everyone, retreating into silence. Watching her crumble filled me with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt vindicated, she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of unease in my gut. Was this really the outcome I wanted? To see her reduced to a shadow of herself? As I sipped my tea that morning, I realized something unsettling. Revenge wasn't as sweet as I'd imagined. In fact, it left a bitter aftertaste. With Claire distracted by her legal troubles, I seized the opportunity to reclaim some semblance of independence. Using the modest savings I'd tucked away over the years, I purchased a small cottage on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, a cozy two-bedroom bungalow with a garden in the backyard, but it was mine. Moving out felt liberating, like shedding layers of resentment and control that had weighed me down for far too long. For the first time in months, I woke up each morning feeling free. Daniel helped me pack and move, and during those hours together we grew closer than ever. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said one evening as we unpacked boxes. "For everything. I should have stood up to Claire sooner. His apology brought tears to my eyes. Not because I needed validation but because it reminded me of the son I used to know. The kind-hearted boy who once wrote me letters thanking me for all I'd done. I hugged him tightly, letting go of years of hurt and disappointment. Whatever happened next, I knew I'd made the right choice. Life settled into a new rhythm. My days were filled with quiet routines, gardening, reading, volunteering at the local library, and for the first time in years I felt content. Claire meanwhile spiraled further into despair. Rumors spread around town about her scandal and soon enough her reputation was in tatters. At first I felt a grim satisfaction knowing she was paying for her misdeeds. But as weeks passed her desperation became harder to ignore. She showed up at my doorstep one rainy afternoon, drenched and disheveled, begging for forgiveness. "I didn't mean any of it," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please, Margaret, you have to believe me." For a moment I considered softening, offering her a lifeline. But then I remembered all the times she'd dismissed me, belittled me, and treated me like an inconvenience. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily, not yet. Instead I looked her straight in the eye and said, "You reap what you sow, Claire." Her expression hardened and without another word she turned and walked away. As I watched her disappear into the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not really. Weeks turned into months and Claire's downfall became the talk of the town. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Grocery stores, coffee shops, even church. People who once fawned over her success now avoided her like the plague. I tried to ignore the gossip, focusing instead on building my new life in the cottage. Yet no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the lingering unease that settled in my chest. One evening as I watered the plants in my garden, Daniel called. His voice was strained, filled with a mix of frustration and sorrow. "Mom, Claire lost her job," he said. "She's falling apart. I don't know what to do." Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, to revel in the fact that justice had been served, but all I could muster was pity. Claire's arrogance had been her undoing, but watching her unravel wasn't as satisfying as I'd imagined. Instead it left me hollow, as if I'd played a role in something far darker than I'd intended. That night as I sat alone in my living room, I wondered if revenge truly solved anything, or if it only perpetuated pain. Claire's unraveling took its toll on her marriage. Daniel confided in me during one of our weekly dinners that their relationship was hanging by a thread. "She won't talk to me anymore," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "All she does is cry or lash out. I can't keep living like this." He paused, staring at his untouched plate of food. "I think we're done, Mom. I've been thinking about filing for divorce." The news hit me harder than I expected. Divorce wasn't something I ever wanted for my son. It felt like another casualty of the war I'd started. Yet deep down I knew it was inevitable. Claire's toxicity had poisoned their marriage long before I intervened. Still, guilt gnawed at me. Had I pushed too hard? Could I have handled things differently? As Daniel spoke, I realized the ripple effects of my actions were wider than I'd anticipated. This wasn't just about Claire and me anymore. It was about everyone caught in the crossfire. In an effort to find some semblance of peace, I decided to focus on giving back. I began volunteering more regularly at the local community center, helping seniors navigate technology and organize social events. It felt good to be useful, to channel my energy into something positive rather than dwelling on the past. One day, while sorting donations for a charity drive, I stumbled upon a box of old books. Among them was a worn copy of Les Miserables, a novel I hadn't read since my youth. That night, as I flipped through its pages, I found myself drawn to the themes of forgiveness and redemption. Jean Valjean's journey struck a chord deep within me. Like him, I had acted out of anger and hurt, seeking justice but perhaps losing sight of compassion along the way. By the time I finished the book, tears streamed down my face. Was it too late to make amends? Or had I already crossed a line I couldn't uncross? Despite my attempts to move forward, Claire's absence loomed large in my mind. She stopped showing up at family gatherings, stopped answering Daniel's calls, and eventually disappeared altogether. Rumors circulated that she'd packed up and left town, unable to face the shame of her scandal. At first I told myself this was for the best, that she needed space to rebuild her life. But as days turned into weeks without any word from her, doubt crept in. One restless night, I dug out the USB drive containing the evidence I'd gathered against her. Holding it in my hand, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Had I gone too far? Was exposing her crimes worth the destruction it caused? I thought about Daniel, about the fractured family dynamics, about the countless lives affected by my decision. For the first time, I questioned whether I'd been the hero of my own story, or just another villain in someone else's. Then came the letter. It arrived one crisp autumn morning, addressed to me in shaky handwriting. My heart raced as I opened it, half expecting another plea for forgiveness from Claire. But the words inside weren't hers. They belonged to Daniel. In painstaking detail, he recounted how Claire had vanished after leaving a cryptic note suggesting she planned to start over somewhere new. Worse still, he revealed that investigators had uncovered additional evidence tying her to other fraudulent schemes. The case against her was growing stronger, and she faced severe legal consequences if caught. Reading those words left me cold. This wasn't the resolution I'd envisioned. Instead of closure, I felt trapped in a web of unintended consequences. Claire's disappearance wasn't freedom, it was flight. And though part of me believed she deserved accountability, another part mourned the loss of the woman she might have been. That night, as I stared at the letter, I whispered aloud, "What have I done?" Months passed and life slowly returned to a fragile kind of normalcy. Daniel visited often, bringing updates about his pending divorce and plans to rebuild his life. We spent hours talking, laughing, and reminiscing about happier times. Yet despite the progress we made, there was always an unspoken tension between us, a shared understanding of the cost of my revenge. One afternoon, as we sat together on my porch, Daniel turned to me and asked, "Do you think she'll come back?" His question caught me off guard. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Finally, I shook my head. "I don't know, sweetheart. Some wounds run too deep to heal." We sat in silence after that, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for Claire but for the family we'd lost along the way. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't just for others. It was also for me. It was a Tuesday morning when the phone rang, shattering the quiet rhythm of my day. On the other end of the line was a police officer with news that sent chills down my spine. Claire had been involved in a car accident, a fatal one. Her vehicle had veered off a remote highway late at night, crashing into a tree. By the time authorities found her, it was too late. The officer's voice was calm and professional, but his words hit me like a freight train. After hanging up, I sank onto the couch, clutching the phone in trembling hands. Claire was gone. Just like that. Part of me wanted to feel relief. She wouldn't face trial, wouldn't drag anyone else through the mud. But instead, all I felt was guilt. A suffocating wave of regret washed over me as I replayed every decision I'd made since that fateful dinner where she called me a drain. Had my actions driven her to flee? To take reckless risks in her desperation to escape? I couldn't shake the feeling that I bore some responsibility for her death. Claire's funeral was a somber affair. Or rather, it would have been if anyone had shown up. Daniel refused to attend, citing unresolved anger and pain. Even her colleagues and so-called friends stayed away, unwilling to associate themselves with scandal. In the end, only I stood by her grave, staring at the simple wooden casket lowered into the earth. It felt surreal standing there alone, mourning a woman I barely recognized anymore. As the pastor recited generic prayers, memories of Claire flooded my mind, not the cold, calculating version I'd come to despise, but the ambitious young woman who once dreamed of success and stability. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost herself, consumed by greed and fear. And now here she was, reduced to a name on a tombstone. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "I'm sorry." Whether I was apologizing to her or myself, I wasn't sure. All I knew was that forgiveness felt impossible. Not yet, anyway. In the weeks following Claire's death, Daniel withdrew further into himself. He stopped visiting me, stopped answering my calls, and spent most of his days holed up in his apartment. When I finally managed to see him, he looked like a shadow of the man I once knew. His eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped under the weight of grief and guilt. "I should have done more," he muttered, pacing the room. "If I'd been stronger, if I'd stood up to her sooner, maybe none of this would have happened." I tried to comfort him, to remind him that Claire's choices were her own, but my words felt hollow. How could I offer solace when I carried my own share of blame? Watching Daniel spiral into despair broke my heart. This wasn't the future I'd envisioned for him. My revenge hadn't just destroyed Claire. It had fractured our family beyond repair. As I hugged him goodbye that evening, I realized the true cost of my actions. Not just Claire's life but the lives of everyone she touched. The ripple effects of Claire's death continued to spread, touching even those who barely knew her. Neighbors whispered about karma, while others expressed pity for Daniel and me. At the community center where I volunteered, people treated me differently. Some with admiration, others with thinly veiled judgment. It seemed everyone had an opinion about what had happened, but no one truly understood the complexity of it all. One day while sorting donations, I overheard two women gossiping about the scandal. "She got what she deserved," one said, referring to Claire. The other nodded in agreement before adding, "But can you imagine living with that kind of guilt?" Their words struck a nerve, forcing me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. Revenge hadn't brought me peace. Instead, it had left me trapped in a cycle of guilt and regret. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I made a silent promise to myself, to let go of bitterness and focus on healing, however long it might take. Months passed, and though the pain never fully disappeared, I began to find moments of clarity. Standing in front of the mirror one morning, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Gone was the timid, self-effacing widow who allowed herself to be pushed aside. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more flawed. Revenge had changed me, shaping me into a person I wasn't sure I liked. Yet I couldn't deny the lessons it taught me about power, control, and the fragility of human relationships. That afternoon, I visited Claire's grave for the first time since her funeral. The grass had grown wild around her headstone, untouched by visitors. Kneeling beside it, I placed a single white rose on the ground. "I hope you've found peace," I murmured, my voice breaking. Forgiveness still felt out of reach, but acknowledging my role in her tragedy was a start. As I walked away, I realized something important. Letting go wasn't about absolving Claire. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment. With winter approaching, I decided to dedicate my time to helping others. Volunteering became my anchor, grounding me in purpose and connection. I organized workshops for seniors, teaching them how to use technology to stay connected with loved ones. I also started a small support group for caregivers, sharing stories and offering advice based on my own experiences. Each act of kindness felt like a step toward redemption, a way to honor the lives impacted by my choices. Daniel began joining me occasionally, finding solace in helping others as well. Though our relationship remained fragile, we slowly rebuilt trust, piecing together the fragments of our family. One evening, as we sat side by side watching the sunset, he turned to me and said, "Mom, I think we'll be okay." His words brought tears to my eyes, not because they erased the past but because they offered hope for the future. For the first time in years, I believed him. On the anniversary of Claire's death, I returned to her grave one last time. This visit felt different, less about guilt and more about closure. I knelt beside her headstone, tracing the engraved letters of her name with my fingers. "You were wrong about many things," I whispered, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "But you didn't deserve to die the way you did. I wish I could have saved you, from yourself, from me, from everything." As I stood to leave, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves above me, carrying with it a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. It was as if Claire were whispering back, urging me to move forward. Walking away, I realized I wasn't saying goodbye to her. I was saying goodbye to the anger, the guilt, and the need for vengeance that had consumed me for so long. Forgiveness wouldn't come overnight, but it was within reach. And that was enough. The final chapter of my story isn't one of triumph or redemption. It's one of acceptance. Revenge doesn't heal wounds. It creates new ones, leaving scars that may never fade. Through Claire, I learned that evil isn't always born. It's often cultivated by circumstance, fear, and insecurity. And through my own journey, I discovered that holding on to hate only poisons the soul. Today, as I sit on my porch watching the world pass by, I reflect on the choices I made and their consequences. Some wounds will never fully heal, but they've taught me invaluable lessons about compassion, humility, and the importance of breaking cycles of harm. If I could go back, I'd handle things differently, not out of weakness but out of strength. Because true courage lies not in fighting fire with fire, but in choosing love over hate, even when it's hardest. And so, I close this chapter of my life with a heavy heart but a renewed spirit. Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's necessary, for Claire, for Daniel, and most importantly for myself. Life is fleeting, fragile, and far too precious to waste on bitterness.